It was a warm autumn afternoon in St. Mary Mead, the kind of day that invited long, leisurely walk through the village, where the russet leaves scattered across the cobblestones and the scent of freshly baked bread wafted through the air from Mrs. Hawkins' bakery. The village was as quiet as ever, a picture of rural tranquility. Life moved at its own gentle pace, with the townsfolk exchanging greetings and small talk as they went about their business. The village had long been a sanctuary of peace until today. Chapter 01. The source of the disturbance was a simple garden party, hosted by the Darby family in their sprawling estate. Invitations had been sent out to nearly everyone in the village, promising an afternoon of tea, light music, and the usual round of social pleasantries. It was a perfect setting for a quiet gathering. However, things took a sudden, shocking turn when a scream echoed across the gardens. It was as though the world shifted in an instant. The joyful chatter that had filled the air abruptly stopped, and a silence descended upon the party like a heavy fog. Then, another scream, this one more desperate, tore through the air. Miss Marple, who had been sitting quietly in a corner with her tea, set down her cup and rose from her chair. She had already begun to observe the tension in the room, the forced smiles, the nervous glances. There was something under the surface at the Darby estate, something not right. And now, the scream had confirmed it. The scream had come from the west side of the garden, near the hedgerow, where a small gathering of guests had been standing. As Miss Marple made her way toward the source of the sound, the crowd parted for her with the familiar reverence given to a woman of her age and reputation. She had lived in St. Mary Mead for many years, and in that time, she had seen her fair share of incidents, some more scandalous than others. But this was something entirely different. Miss Marple arrived at the scene to find the source of the commotion. Mrs. Edith Darby, the lady of the house, standing at the edge of a rose garden, her face ashen. Her hands trembled, clutching at a letter she had just pulled from the ground. Miss Marple's keen eyes immediately took in the scene, the chaos, the people milling about. The sudden shock of the moment then turned back to Mrs. Darby, whose composure was beginning to slip. "What happened, Mrs. Darby?" Miss Marple asked softly, her voice gentle, but carrying the authority of someone accustomed to observing human nature. Mrs. Darby looked up, her eyes wide with panic. "It's my daughter, Clara," she said, her voice trembling. "She's gone, vanished. ICM was here one moment, and then, without warning, gone. I don't know what's happened." Miss Marple raised a calm hand, allowing the distraught woman a moment to regain her composure. "I see. Has anyone else noticed her absence?" The partygoers gathered nervously around, some of them whispering among themselves, others standing frozen in shock. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the group, noting the varying degrees of concern on their faces. A few seemed genuinely worried, while others wore the uncomfortable masks of people unsure whether to act or to wait for someone else to make the first move. "I'll help look for her, of course," Miss Marple continued, her voice still soft, but with a steel edge to it now. "We'll find her." But as the crowd began to search the grounds, Miss Marple noticed something. Mrs. Darby had not looked directly at her when she spoke of Clara's disappearance. Instead, her eyes had darted to the far side of the garden, where a cluster of other guests was standing. It was a subtle gesture, a slight flicker of nervousness, but Miss Marple caught it, and it piqued her curiosity. The search continued for what felt like hours. It was likely only a matter of minutes. The grounds of the Darby estate were expansive, the hedgerows and flower beds sprawling in every direction. Miss Marple, however, knew better than to rely on the frantic rush of others. She stepped aside, quietly observing the way people moved, the way they spoke to one another. Then, out of the corner of her eye, Miss Marple saw a figure, Edward Pierce, a recent arrival in the village, and a man who had quickly earned a reputation as both charming and enigmatic. He was standing by the rose garden, looking at the ground with an unreadable expression on his face. Miss Marple knew Pierce well enough to recognize the discomfort in his posture. He wasn't involved in the search, yet he seemed oddly out of place, like a man who was trying too hard to look unaffected by the situation. Pierce's relationship with the Darbys was well known, at least on the surface. He had been involved in several of their land dealings, and while his connections had raised eyebrows, no one had yet been able to uncover any real cause for concern. His position was ambiguous, neither close enough to be considered family, nor distant enough to be viewed with complete suspicion. But there was something about him that Miss Marple found unsettling. His presence today, his apparent detachment, felt more like the sign of someone who knew more than they let on. As she approached, Miss Marple made a quiet observation to herself. He wasn't looking for Clara, as the others were. He was waiting. But for what? Miss Marple's attention was suddenly drawn to another figure approaching the garden. A man who, though not a stranger to her, had yet to reveal his true role in this unfolding drama. Henry Carrington, the wealthy landowner from the neighboring estate, was now standing at the edge of the gathering. His face was unreadable, and yet Miss Marple could see the tension in his jaw. The way he clenched his fists. Carrington and the Darby family had a long history. Miss Marple knew that much. But there was something about Carrington's about the way he held himself, that hinted at a man who had much to gain from the secrets surrounding Clara's disappearance. And it wasn't just the land deals, though that was certainly part of it. No, there was something more personal at stake here. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. But Miss Marple knew better than to rush to conclusions. She had learned long ago that the truth would not be hurried, that the village had a way of holding its secrets tightly. And though Miss Marple was no stranger to the workings of human nature, this case was shaping up to be more tangled than any she had encountered in years. She needed more time. She needed more information. And above all, she needed to watch carefully. The villagers, Mrs. Darby, Pierce, Carrington, and the rest were all playing their parts in a drama much larger than they realized. But Miss Marple was patient. She had always been patient. As the evening wore on, Miss Marple took a final look at the crowd before her eyes lingered once more on Edward Pierce. He was watching her now, his eyes meeting hers across the garden. For just a moment, there was a flicker of something Miss Marple couldn't quite place. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. The mystery was far from over. But one thing was certain. Edward Pierce, for all his charm, was hiding something. And Miss Marple was determined to find out exactly what. The air had grown heavier as the afternoon wore on. The oppressive silence of the village square, now punctuated by the occasional hushed whisper. The garden party at the Darby estate had dissolved into a chaotic flurry of searchers, all of them now deeply engaged in their own desperate efforts to find Clara Ashton. The entire village seemed to have turned its eyes toward the Darby estate. No one had expected something like this to happen, not here, not in their seemingly idyllic corner of the world. Miss Marple had returned to her cottage briefly, reflecting on what she had seen, the oddness of the situation weighing heavily on her thoughts. The more she observed the villagers' behavior, the clearer it became that something larger was at play. Clara Ashton's sudden disappearance was only the beginning, and Miss Marple had a feeling that the answers were buried much deeper than anyone imagined. After a few moments of solitude, she decided to take another walk to the Darby estate. The village was still buzzing with rumors, and the whispers she overheard hinted at a growing suspicion of Edward Pierce. Many of the locals were drawing their conclusions, as they always did, quickly, without the care or precision of someone who truly sought the truth. But Miss Marple had learned long ago to trust her instincts. She was never quick to judge. She preferred to let the facts reveal themselves. It was dusk by the time she arrived at the Darby estate, and the gardens were still filled with anxious figures. Edward Pierce was standing at the far end, watching the proceedings with what appeared to be a carefully cultivated air of indifference. He looked up briefly as Miss Marple approached, offering her a brief, almost too polite smile that did not reach his eyes. "Good evening, Miss Marple," Pierce said smoothly, his tone calm but with an edge of something Miss Marple couldn't quite place. "I trust everything is well." Miss Marple took a moment to study him carefully. There was something about his demeanor, something that seemed rehearsed, as though he was playing a part. She had learned over the years to observe these small tells, to read the subtleties in people's faces and actions. Edward Pierce, while still maintaining his calm facade, was not unaffected by the situation. He was trying too hard to appear unaffected. "Is everything all right, Mr. Pierce?" Miss Marple asked, her voice measured, giving nothing away. "It seems the village is in a state of upheaval this evening." Pierce hesitated for just a fraction of a second, then shook his head. "Indeed, it's quite unsettling," he said, his eyes shifting to the gathering crowd. "Clara has been with us for quite some time, and to have her vanish so suddenly is disturbing. I trust the authorities will get to the bottom of it." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes never leaving his. "I'm sure they will," she said quietly, before adding with casual interest, "But you and Mrs. Darby are well acquainted, aren't you? I understand you've worked together on several occasions." Pierce's posture stiffened imperceptibly at the mention of Mrs. Darby. For just a moment, Miss Marple caught a fleeting glimpse of something in his eyes, hint of something deeper, a shadow of unease, but it was gone almost before it had appeared. "We've done business together over the years," Pierce replied, his voice smooth. "Nothing more than that. You know how these things go, okay? Land deals, contracts, all quite above board." Miss Marple studied him closely, allowing her silence to hang between them, making him shift uncomfortably under her gaze. She knew better than to press him directly. He was playing a careful game, but Miss Marple was patient. She would wait until he slipped. Everyone did, eventually. "Well," she said finally, breaking the silence, "I trust the matter will be resolved soon. It's a terrible situation all around. The village will be on edge until Clara is found, I'm sure." Pierce offered another tight smile. "Okay, indeed," he said, before excusing himself with a small bow. "I must attend to some matters. Good evening, Miss Marple." Miss Marple watched him walk away, her mind already churning. There was something about him, something that didn't quite add up. His politeness was calculated, and the brief flicker of discomfort she had seen in his eyes was enough to tell her that he wasn't entirely as innocent as he appeared. Turning her attention back to the search efforts, Miss Marple noticed a few more familiar faces. Among them was Mrs. Whittaker, the postmistress, standing near the edge of the estate, speaking with a couple of other villagers. Miss Marple had always found Mrs. Whittaker to be a font of useful information. Whether the woman knew it or not, she was a quiet observer, someone who absorbed everything around her. Miss Marple approached her slowly, careful to blend in with the casual movements of the search. "Mrs. Whittaker," she said, her voice friendly but quiet, as though they were continuing a conversation from earlier. "How have you been this evening?" Mrs. Whittaker glanced up, surprised, but gave Miss Marple a nod of recognition. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't see you there. It's quite a dreadful situation, isn't it? I do hope Clara is found safe and sound soon." "It's troubling indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "I've been thinking about it, and the more I think, the more I wonder, what do you think of Edward Pierce's role in all of this? Have you seen anything unusual?" Mrs. Whittaker's eyes flickered nervously, but she quickly regained her composure. "Well, now that you mention it," she said in a low voice, "I've seen him around the village a lot lately, more than usual. I don't know why, but it's like he's been keeping to himself more these past few weeks. I've seen him talking to a few people, but he's never been too open, always so secretive. Can't say for sure, but there's something about him, Miss Marple, that rubs me the wrong way. Miss Marple's interest piqued at Mrs. Whittaker's words. Really? What sort of things did you notice? Oh, Mrs. Whittaker said, glancing around again as though to make sure no one was listening. It's nothing concrete, you know, just the way he walks around. He's very careful about his movements. And the last time he was here, he seemed ... upset. Not like his usual calm self. He left in quite a hurry. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. She could see where Mrs. Whittaker was coming from, though she wasn't ready to jump to conclusions. Yet, the subtlety of Pierce's movements, his secretiveness, these were all things to consider. The pieces were falling into place, but there was still a great deal to be uncovered. Thank you, Mrs. Whittaker, Miss Marple said, giving the postmistress a reassuring smile. You've been very helpful. As Mrs. Whittaker moved away, Miss Marple stood there for a moment, deep in thought. She had known for some time that Pierce was hiding something, but now, with the details Mrs. Whittaker had shared, Miss Marple had a clearer sense of how the pieces fit together. But one thing was still missing. It's the real reason for Clara's disappearance. It wasn't just about the land deals. There was something more to it, something personal. Miss Marple had been right to keep her suspicions about Edward Pierce, but it was time to dig deeper. To look beyond the surface. Turning back toward the estate, Miss Marple knew that the village was close to breaking, but so too was Edward Pierce. He would reveal his true nature soon enough, but only if she pressed him just a little further, and Miss Marple was always ready to take that next step. The investigation was no longer just a search for Clara. It had become something far more significant. The town's secrets were beginning to bleed into the open, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence and sharp eyes, would be there to see them exposed one by one. Chapter 02. The following morning, the village of St. Mary Mead was draped in a heavy silence. Miss Marple had spent most of the night turning over the events of the previous day, trying to make sense of the chaotic scenes she had witnessed at the Darby estate. Clara Ashton's disappearance and the subsequent discovery of her body had cast a long shadow over the village. It was a peaceful place by nature, but now every corner seemed to whisper with suspicion. Every glance felt heavy with unspoken words. Miss Marple had learned long ago that there were few things as dangerous as secrets, and in St. Mary Mead there were plenty of those to go around. She had already formed some opinions about the key players in the mystery. Edward Pierce, the mysterious outsider. The Darby family, whose secrets seemed to be buried in their grand estate. Of course, the various villagers who, like all small communities, carried their own histories and intrigues. But despite her sharp observations, Miss Marple knew better than to jump to conclusions too quickly. The most dangerous mistakes were often made when someone assumed they understood the whole picture. Today, she had a plan though. Like everything she did, it was methodical and deliberate. She needed more information about Edward Pierce's past, more about his connections to the Darby family. And, most importantly, she needed to understand what Clara had uncovered that had made her such a target. There were whispers that Clara had been asking too many questions about things people in the village preferred to leave unexamined. She had stirred something in the air, something dark and long hidden. Miss Marple walked down the familiar path to the local library, the stone building tucked away on the edge of the village. It was an unassuming place, but Miss Marple knew that the library held the answers to many of the village's secrets. The librarian, Mrs. Colson, was an old friend, someone who had long since learned to keep her ears open and her lips sealed. If anyone had information about the Darby estate, the dealings of the villagers, or the oddities of Pierce's arrival in town, it was Mrs. Colson. When Miss Marple entered, the smell of old books and paper immediately filled the air. Mrs. Colson looked up from her desk, her face lighting up with recognition, but her eyes also held a hint of concern, as if she had heard about the tragedy that had befallen the village and knew what Miss Marple was here for. "Good morning, Miss Marple." Mrs. Coulson greeted her warmly. "I trust you're well, despite everything." Miss Marple gave a polite nod, her expression calmed but her eyes sharp. "I've been better, Mrs. Coulson, but I find that some mysteries are better solved sooner rather than later, I'm afraid. I'm in need of some assistance. It seems there are more secrets in St. Mary Mead than I had anticipated." Mrs. Coulson's face shifted slightly, the concern deepening. "There's always something hiding beneath the surface, isn't there? What can I help you with?" "I'm looking into the background of Edward Pierce," Miss Marple said, choosing her words carefully. "I believe there's more to his arrival in the village than most people know. And, if I'm not mistaken, it's linked to the Darby estate." Mrs. Coulson's eyes widened imperceptibly, and she stepped closer to Miss Marple, lowering her voice. "I've heard talk, Miss Marple, but I didn't think it was my place to repeat it. But since you've asked, ... Miss Marple waited patiently, as Mrs. Coulson hesitated, then continued in a quiet murmur. "Edward Pierce came here about 2 years ago, looking for work, they say. He didn't have much to his name, but somehow he managed to win the favor of the Darby family. They had been looking for someone to manage some of their properties, and Pierce seemed like the perfect fit. But there's always been something odd about him. He was too smooth, too polished. Not the kind of man you'd expect to be managing a rural estate. At least, not in the way he did. He wasn't from around here, you know? No family connections, no real history in the village. Just someone who appeared out of nowhere and suddenly had influence." Marple nodded, her mind already turning over the pieces. "I've noticed that as well. It's always been a bit of an enigma. What else do you know about his dealings with the Darby family?" Mrs. Coulson looked around the library as if to ensure no one else was listening before she leaned in further. "There were whispers, you know, whispers about land deals, about contracts that were signed quickly and without much question. People said he was managing more than just the estate. He was getting involved in business dealings, making connections with people outside the village, including Henry Carrington, the local landowner. The Darby family wasn't exactly thrilled about it, but they didn't seem to have much choice. At least, that's what I've heard." Henry Carrington's name caught Miss Marple's attention immediately. He had been a silent figure in the background of many of the village's more delicate matters, but she had never fully understood his connection to the Darbys. If Pierce was working with Carrington, it could explain a great deal. "Carrington," Miss Marple repeated quietly. "I see. So, you believe Pierce may have been using the Darby estate for something more than just land management?" Mrs. Coulson nodded, her voice tinged with concern. "That's what people say, but no one has ever been able to prove it. The Darbys themselves were very careful, always covering their tracks. But when Clara started asking questions, people began to take notice. She wasn't just interested in land deals, mind you. She was asking about other things that seemed to make the Darby family nervous." Miss Marple's eyes sparkled with understanding. So Clara knew something that had been hidden beneath the surface for years. "Yes," Mrs. Coulson confirmed, her tone low. "And when she started asking the right questions, the kind of questions people weren't supposed to ask, she became a threat. That's when everything changed. The whispers became darker, and before we knew it, Clara was gone." Miss Marple stood in silence for a moment, processing the information. Everything she had suspected was now becoming clearer. Pierce wasn't just a man with business interests. He was part of a larger, more dangerous scheme, and Clara's discovery had led her to the heart of it. "Thank you, Mrs. Coulson," Miss Marple said, her voice firm. "You've been most helpful. I believe we are closer to understanding what happened, but there is still much to uncover. Do you have any records, any documents about Pierce or the Darby estate that might help?" Mrs. Coulson hesitated, then nodded. "I'll see what I can find. There might be something in the back records, though it's a bit old-fashioned. Anything you can provide will will be most useful, Miss Marple replied, her mind already turning toward the next steps. As Miss Marple left the library, the wind had begun to pick up, the first signs of rain starting to fall. It was as if the weather itself was in tune with the mystery unfolding in the village. Unpredictable, unsettled, and threatening, Miss Marple's thoughts were racing. Pierce, Carrington, and the Derby estate was all connected. Clara had been getting too close to something that had been buried for far too long. But who had the most to gain from silencing her? As Miss Marple walked back toward her cottage, she knew the answer was just within reach. She could feel it in her bones. The pieces were aligning, and soon the truth would be uncovered. But there was still a dangerous road ahead, and the storm was only beginning to build. The weather had shifted by the time Miss Marple reached her cottage, and the quiet evening was now filled with a low rumble of distant thunder. The wind, which had been calm earlier, had begun to whip through the trees, sending leaves scattering across the ground in a swirling dance. There was a heaviness in the air, as though the atmosphere itself was preparing for the storm that was about to break, not just in the skies, but in the village itself. Inside her cottage, Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea and settled into her favorite armchair by the fire. The warmth from the hearth did little to quell the unease that had settled in her chest. The discovery of Clara Ashton's body, so carefully arranged in the garden, still haunted her thoughts. The way the young woman had been placed there spoke volumes. This was no random act. It was a message. Miss Marple had already formed a theory, though it was still far from complete. Edward Pierce was at the center of it, no doubt, but there was more to the story, much more. The whispering shadows of the Derby family's land dealings, the suspicious connection to Henry Carrington, and now the strange silence surrounding Pierce's every move. These were the threads Miss Marple was following. But with every revelation, more questions seemed to arise. The letter Pierce had written, now discovered to have been hidden under Clara's body, seemed to confirm what Miss Marple had suspected about the power struggle behind the land dealings. It wasn't just about money, it was about control. Pierce had been doing Carrington's bidding, but there was still the matter of his true motivations. What was he after, and why had he gone to such lengths to eliminate Clara? As Miss Marple sipped her tea, she let her mind wander back to the conversation with Mrs. Whittaker in the library. The village postmistress had revealed more than she had intended, and Miss Marple had gleaned just enough from their exchange to set her on the right path. Clara had been asking questions, dangerous questions about the Derby estate's finances, the land deals, and the involvement of Carrington and Pierce. But why? What had driven her to dig so deeply into a matter that had never been questioned before? The answer, Miss Marple believed, lay in the connections Clara had uncovered between the Derby estate and Carrington's illegal dealings. The land purchases, the hidden transactions, and the quiet manipulation of power. These were the real reasons for Clara's demise. But someone had to have been pulling the strings. Someone far more powerful than Pierce, and more dangerous. As Miss Marple mulled over these thoughts, there was a gentle knock at the door. She set her teacup down and rose to answer it, wondering who it might be. When she opened the door, she was surprised to find Hawkins, the constable, standing there, his expression grim. "Good evening, Miss Marple," Hawkins said, his tone measured, but with an underlying sense of urgency. "I trust I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Hawkins," Miss Marple replied. "Please, come in." "What brings you here at this hour?" Hawkins stepped inside, glancing over his shoulder as though ensuring no one had followed him. T lowered his voice as he spoke, his eyes darting around the room. "It's about Pierce," he said. "We found something that changes everything." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "What have you found, Hawkins?" "We've been going over the records from the Derby estate, the ones Pierce was managing. First, it all seemed legitimate, just business as usual. But as we dug deeper, we came across something strange. There were a series of transactions, all dated around the same time as Clara's disappearance. A lot of money was moved around, but not in the way you'd expect. And here's the odd part. The name on the paperwork isn't Pierce's, it's Carrington's. Miss Marple felt her pulse quickened. Carrington, as she repeated, her voice tight with surprise. That's unexpected. I thought so too, Hawkins said, his voice low. We've been trying to track down the details, but it's clear that Carrington was involved in some way. Pierce, for all his charm, wasn't acting alone. He's been working with Carrington behind the scenes, funneling money and assets through the Darby estate. And now, we're beginning to see that this goes beyond land deals. Miss Marple's mind was racing. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but there was still so much left to uncover. Why had Carrington used Pierce as a front? And what did they stand to gain from manipulating the Darby family's estate? But there's more, Hawkins continued, his voice barely a whisper. We found a letter from Carrington to Pierce, but it was never sent. It was hidden among the papers in the office. It's addressed to Pierce, and it's a threat. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. A threat. A threat. Hawkins nodded. It's not like anything we've seen before. Carrington's words were cryptic, but it's clear that he was warning Pierce to stay in line. If Pierce didn't deliver on something, Carrington threatened to expose him. We think it's tied to the land deals, but it could be more. It could be that Carrington was using Pierce for something much darker. Miss Marple stood still for a moment, absorbing the information. The implications were chilling. Pierce had been at Carrington's mercy, using his influence to cover up something far worse than just financial misdeeds. And Clara, in her quest for answers, had uncovered it all. She had become a liability, someone who knew too much. Do you have the letter, Hawkins? Miss Marple asked quietly, her mind already formulating her next move. Hawkins handed her the letter, its contents still partially folded. Miss Marple carefully unfolded it and began to read. Pierce, you have done well in securing the estate, but do not forget your place. You are nothing without my backing. Deliver on the promised land deals, or I will expose everything. Okay? The Darbys are fools, but I have no patience for failure. If you do not comply, there will be consequences for you and your family. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she read the letter, her thoughts swirling. The note was a direct threat, meant to keep Pierce in line, but it also revealed something more. Carrington was at the heart of this, pulling the strings, and Pierce had been nothing more than a tool. But now, something had gone wrong. Pierce's own survival instincts had kicked in, and he had started to play his own game. This changes everything, Miss Marple murmured, the pieces finally clicking into place. Pierce was never the mastermind. Carrington is. And if Clara had discovered this, Hawkins finished her thought for her. Then, she was killed to keep her quiet. She knew too much. Miss Marple turned to face Hawkins, her expression steely. We need to confront Carrington, but we must be careful. He's not going to let this go easily. And Piercy's still out there, trying to cover his tracks. We need to find him before he disappears. Hawkins nodded. I'll make sure. We're prepared. Miss Marple paused, her mind still spinning with the revelations. There's one more thing we need to do, Hawkins. We need to speak to the Darbys. They've been hiding more than they let on. I suspect they know more about Carrington's dealings than they're letting on. As Miss Marple set her teacup down with a deliberate motion, she knew that the end was drawing near. The truth was within reach, but it was more dangerous than ever. And the storm she could feel was just about to break. Chapter 03. The rain had begun to fall steadily by the time Miss Marple made her way toward the Darby estate. Once more, the small village of St. Mary Mead which had been so full of life and warmth just a few days ago, now seemed almost suffocating, weighed down by the impending revelations. The storm outside mirrored the storm brewing within the village gossip. Suspicion and fear now rippling through the tightly knit community. Miss Marple's mind was no longer wandering. She had been given the pieces she needed. The puzzle was nearly complete, but there was still one more thread to pull. She had no doubt that Edward Pierce and Henry Carrington were the central figures in the web of deceit that had led to Clara Ashton's tragic death. However, it wasn't just about them. The Darby family, too, had their hands in a tangled mess, and it was time to confront them. Miss Marple knew that Mrs. Darby had her own secrets. She'd seen it in the woman's eyes during their earlier conversations, the guilt, the fear of being caught in a lie that had grown too large to cover up. The grand Darby estate loomed ahead, its imposing silhouette against the darkening sky, a fitting backdrop to the unfolding drama. Miss Marple's footsteps on the wet cobblestones were steady, deliberate. She'd been here before, many times, but this visit felt different. Today, she wasn't just a guest at a garden party. She was the one who would bring the truth into the light, no matter how painful it might be. As she approached the entrance, she was greeted by Mr. Hargrove, the butler, who, though always polite, seemed a little more tense than usual. His eyes flickered nervously as he led her inside. "Good evening, Miss Marple," Mr. Hargrove said in his usual calm, measured tone. "I trust you're doing well." "I'm managing, Mr. Hargrove," Miss Marple replied, giving him a warm but knowing smile. "But I'm afraid I must speak with Mrs. Darby about something rather pressing." Mr. Hargrove hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Of course, Miss Marple. I'll let her know you're here." The grand hallway of the Darby estate was eerily quiet as Miss Marple waited, the soft tick of the grandfather clock in the corner the only sound breaking the stillness. She could feel the weight of the place's history, secret sand, for the first time in many years. She couldn't shake the feeling that something deeply wrong had taken root here. Moments later, Mrs. Darby appeared at the top of the staircase, her once imposing presence now diminished by the fatigue etched into her face. Her eyes were shadowed, and though she offered Miss Marple a courteous smile, there was an unmistakable tension in her movements. "Miss Marple," she said softly, descending the stairs slowly. "I was hoping you might come by. I've been expecting you." Miss Marple stepped forward, her gaze steady but kind. "Mrs. Darby, I'm afraid there are things we must discuss, important matters. I know this has been a difficult time, but it is crucial that we speak." Mrs. Darby's smile faltered, and she motioned toward the drawing room. "Please, come in. We can talk privately." Once inside, Miss Marple took a seat across from Mrs. Darby, whose hands were tightly clasped in her lap. The tension between them was palpable, the silence stretching thin as Miss Marple waited for the woman to speak. She knew that Mrs. Darby was struggling, caught between the truth and the protection of her family. But Miss Marple also knew that it was time for the truth to come out. "Mrs. Darby," Miss Marple began, her voice soft but firm, "I've spent many years in this village, and I've seen my fair share of secrets. But the one that is playing out before us now is not something that can be hidden any longer." Mrs. Darby's eyes flickered briefly, and her lips tightened. "I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple. We've been through enough already." Miss Marple studied her closely. "Clara's death. It wasn't just a random act, was it? There's more to it. She wasn't just a victim of circumstance. She uncovered something, Mrs. Darby, something you and your family would rather have kept hidden." Mrs. Darby's breath hitched, and, for a brief moment, Miss Marple saw her hands tremble in her lap. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. There was fear in Mrs. Darby's eyes now, fear of what would happen when the truth came out. I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple," Mrs. Darby said weakly, though the quiver in her voice betrayed her. "Clara was a good girl, but she She was far too inquisitive. She asked questions that shouldn't have been asked. The Darby family's affairs are private. But Clara wasn't just asking about the family's affairs. Miss Marple pressed gently. Ski was digging into something much larger, something connected to the land deals, to Carrington and Pierce. You know this. Key knew she was getting too close. Mrs. Darby's face drained of color. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Miss Marple allowed the silence to hang for a moment, watching her closely. "You're afraid, aren't you?" Miss Marple said, her voice softening just a touch. "You're afraid that when the truth comes out, it will ruin everything. The land, the deals, your family's reputation. But you can't hide behind fear any longer." Clara knew something that led her to her death, and it's tied to Pierce, isn't it? Mrs. Darby's eyes widened, and her hands clenched. "You don't understand?" she whispered. "Okay, I did what I had to do. I never meant for any of this to happen. But Clara, she was a threat, okay? A threat to everything we've worked for." Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice gentle but resolute. A threat. Clara was only trying to uncover the truth. She didn't deserve to die. No one deserves that. Mrs. Darby looked away, her lips trembling. "I didn't want this, Miss Marple, but Henry Carrington had his own plans, and Pierce, he would do anything to stay in Carrington's good graces. He was the one who made the call. It wasn't supposed to be this way. But Clara, she found out too much. And she wasn't the only one." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, Mrs. Darby? Who else?" "Can't say," Mrs. Darby replied, her voice breaking. "I've already said too much. But you have to understand it's not just Pierce and Carrington. There are others involved. People with power. The family name, the estate, everything is on the line. I was trying to protect it." Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her mind racing. The tangled web of land deals, Carrington's involvement, Pierce's manipulation, it was becoming clearer. But it was still far from complete. "You have to help me, Mrs. Darby," Miss Marple said softly, her voice coaxing. "The truth is, the only thing that will set you free. If you keep hiding behind these walls, it will destroy everything." Mrs. Darby looked at her, her expression torn between fear and something else, something that resembled relief. After a long moment of silence, she finally spoke. "I'll tell you everything," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But you have to promise me you'll protect my family." Miss Marple nodded. I promise. The storm outside raged on, but inside the Darby estate, the storm of secrets was finally starting to break. The truth was within reach, and Miss Marple was ready to uncover the final pieces. But with every revelation, the danger was growing. The final confrontation with Pierce and Carrington was inevitable, but Miss Marple was prepared. She had waited for this moment, and now it was time to expose the truth, no matter the cost. Miss Marple had always been patient, waiting for the right moment to confront the truth. But now, with the pieces falling into place, she felt the weight of what was to come pressing down on her. The Darby estate, once a symbol of wealth and stability, now stood as a house of secrets, built on a foundation of deceit and manipulation. Clara's death, the key to unraveling everything, had become the catalyst for something much darker than anyone in the village could have imagined. As the rain continued to pour outside, Miss Marple sat across from Mrs. Darby, who had finally confessed to her role in the cover-up. The woman's face was pale, her eyes hollow from the strain of years spent hiding the truth. But despite the anguish she had caused, Miss Marple could see the relief in her eyes. The weight of guilt had begun to lift, and in its place was something that resembled acceptance. Though it was clear that Mrs. Darby wasn't yet ready to face the full extent of her actions, Miss Marple took a deep breath and leaned forward, a voice steady but firm. You've told me a great deal, Mrs. Darby, but there's still more to uncover. Clara wasn't the only one at risk, was she? You said earlier that there were others involved. Who else knows about this? Mrs. Darby's gaze flickered toward the window, as if she were searching for an escape from the truth. I never wanted this, Miss Marple, she whispered, her voice trembling. I never wanted any of this, but Henry Carrington, he was the one who pushed us into it. He made it impossible to turn back, and Pierce was his pawn. He did everything Carrington asked, no questions asked. Even when it meant getting rid of people who might expose them. Miss Marple's mind raced as she pieced together the fragments of information Mrs. Darby had revealed. Carrington, the powerful landowner, had been the driving force behind the scheme, using his wealth and influence to manipulate the Darbys and Pierce for his own gain. And Pierce, as Miss Marple had suspected, was not merely an innocent bystander. He was a willing accomplice, complicit in every dark deal and deceitful maneuver. But there was still something missing. Clara had been on the brink of discovering the full extent of Carrington and Pierce's machinations. She had been getting too close to the truth, and that had made her a target. Hey, but why had Clara been the one to uncover it all? What had driven her to dig so deeply? Tell me more about Clara, Miss Marple said softly, her voice coaxing. What was it that she discovered? What did she learn that made her such a threat? Mrs. Darby hesitated, her eyes clouding with regret. Clara. She was different from the others, right? She had a way of seeing things that no one else did. She asked the right questions, Miss Marple. Questions about the land deals, about the money flowing in and out of the estate. She started noticing the discrepancies, the things that didn't add up. She was getting too close to the truth. She was dangerous. Dangerous to whom, Miss Marple asked, her gaze unwavering. To Carrington, Mrs. Darby replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Carrington knew she was getting close. He knew she would expose everything, and that couldn't happen. She had to be stopped. And Pierce, Pierce did the dirty work. He was the one who arranged everything, who made sure Clara disappeared. Marple leaned back in her chair, her mind working furiously as she absorbed the information. Mrs. Darby's confession had given her more than she had hoped for, but the final piece was still elusive. What had Clara found that had made her such a threat to Carrington and Pierce? What had been the thing that tipped the balance? I need to know everything, Mrs. Darby, Miss Marple said, her voice calm but insistent. I need to understand the full extent of what's been happening here. It's the only way to bring this to an end. Mrs. Darby's face twisted with guilt, but there was a flicker of determination in her eyes now. Clara had found something in the estate's record, something we thought was hidden. A set of contracts, signed in secrecy, that outlined a deal between Carrington and a group of investors. It wasn't just land deals, Miss Marple. It was about power. Carrington was using the estate as collateral for something much more dangerous. He had plans for the village plans that would have torn it apart. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. The contracts. Clara had found something far more significant than anyone had realized. It wasn't just about land, it was about control. Carrington had been using the Darby estate to manipulate the entire village, and it seemed that the land was only the beginning of his plans. And Pierce was involved in all of this? Miss Marple asked, her voice low. Mrs. Darby nodded. Yes, Pierce was the one who made sure the contracts were signed, who kept everything running smoothly for Carrington. He was the one who handled the dirty work, making sure that anyone who got too close to the truth disappeared. And when Clara found out about the contracts, when she started asking questions, Pierce decided she had to go. Miss Marple stood up slowly, her mind reeling with the information. She had always suspected that there was more to Pierce than met the eye, but now she knew the full extent of his involvement. He had been Carrington's pawn, and now he was trying to cover his tracks. "There's no time to waste," Miss Marple said, her voice hard with resolve. "We need to confront Pierce and Carrington. The truth has to come out." "But how?" Mrs. Darby asked, her voice strained. "How can we stop them?" Miss Marple turned toward the door, her expression determined. "We have to expose them. The contracts, the money, everything. It's all connected, and once the truth is out, there will be no place for them to hide." Mrs. Darby rose from her seat, her face a mixture of fear and hope. "Will it be enough?" Miss Marple turned back to her, her eyes kind but unwavering. "It will be enough. The truth always comes to light, Mrs. Darby. It just takes a little time." As Miss Marple made her way out of the Darby estate, she knew that the final confrontation was near. The pieces of the puzzle were all falling into place, and it was only a matter of time before everything was exposed. Pierce and Carrington's reign over the village was coming to an end, and Miss Marple would see to it that the truth was revealed. The storm outside had intensified, but Miss Marple walked steadily, unfazed by the rain and wind. She had seen storms before both literal and metaphoric land, knew that the calm would come once the storm had passed, and in St. Mary Mead, the storm was only beginning to break. Chapter 04. The storm outside raged on, its fury mirroring the quiet storm of suspicion and tension that had taken root within the heart of St. Mary Mead. The village had once been a place where everything felt contained, where everyone knew. Their place in the rhythm of life was as predictable as the seasons. But now, in the wake of Clara Ashton's death and the tangled web of deceit that Miss Marple had begun to unravel, the village seemed poised on the brink of something darker. The whispers, once quiet and subdued, were now impossible to ignore. As Miss Marple walked briskly through the rain-soaked streets, her thoughts were sharp and focused. She had spoken to Mrs. Darby, gathered more than enough information to piece together the connections between Carrington, Pierce, and the Darby estate. But the final confrontation and encounter with the man at the center of it all was still ahead of her, and it would not be easy. Carrington was a powerful figure in the village, and Pierce, though clearly a pawn, had proven to be a dangerous one. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the quiet village as she moved through the streets, making her way back to her cottage. The familiar landmarks, the village square, the bakery, the corner shop had taken on an almost eerie quality. The usual hum of village life had fallen silent. The storm had driven most people indoors, but Miss Marple knew the village was bracing itself for something much bigger than the weather. The truth about Clara's death, about the land deals and the manipulation of power, was about to surface. And when it did, everything would change. When Miss Marple finally arrived home, she was greeted by the quiet solitude of her cottage. The fire was low on the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The scent of damp earth and wood smoke filled the air. She sat down at her desk, the weight of the case pressing heavily on her shoulders. She knew that this was the final stretch, that the pieces were all in place. But she needed more. One more conversation, one more thread to pull, and she would have everything she needed. Miss Marple's mind returned to Pierce, to his carefully constructed facade. He had been so meticulous, so poised in his deception, but the cracks had begun to show. And now that she had seen through him, it was only a matter of time before he would reveal his true colors. But first, she needed to speak with him alone. The next morning, as the storm subsided and the clouds began to part, Miss Marple made her way to Pierce's modest cottage on the outskirts of the village. The rain had stopped, but the air still carried a heavy sense of unease. Pierce was the final piece of the puzzle, the man who had been at the center of the conspiracy from the very beginning. If she could confront him, expose him for what he was, the mystery would be solved. When she arrived at Pierce's cottage, she found the door slightly ajar, as though he had been expecting her. It was not an unfamiliar gesture. Pierce had always been polite, even courteous in their past interactions. Okay. But there was something about the openness of the door that felt like a challenge. She stepped inside, her shoes making little sound on the wooden floor. Keptis was modest but well kept, with bookshelves lining the walls and a fire crackling in the hearth. Pierce was sitting in a chair near the fire, his posture tense, but his face calm, as if he were prepared for the conversation that was about to unfold. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. "I was hoping you'd come by. I had a feeling I might," Miss Marple replied, her tone light but with an undercurrent of authority. She took a seat across from him, her eyes studying him carefully. "I understand there's been some talk about you in the village. People are ... curious about your involvement in the recent events." Pierce's gaze shifted slightly, and for the briefest of moments, Miss Marple saw a flicker of something was it guilt cross his face, but he quickly masked it with a polite smile. "Curiosity is natural, Miss Marple, but I assure you, there's nothing untoward about my actions. I've been nothing but straightforward in my dealings." Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Straightforward? Is that what you call it? I've been speaking to people in the village, Mr. Pierce, and they've been more than eager to share their thoughts on your straightforwardness. But I think we both know that the truth is never as simple as that, do we?" Pierce's smile faltered just for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple. I've had nothing to hide." "Oh, but that's where you're wrong," Miss Marple said softly, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "You've hidden more than you know, and you've been careful, haven't you? Carefully orchestrating everything to protect yourself and your secrets. But secrets have a way of coming to light, don't they?" There was a long pause, during which Pierce's eyes flicked toward the window, his jaw tightening. Miss Marple watched him closely, noting every subtle shift in his expression, every slight movement. She had learned long ago that people revealed more about themselves in the smallest details than they ever realized. "I've done nothing wrong, Miss Marple," Pierce said, his voice almost a whisper. "You don't understand? If you knew what I've had to do, you'd see things differently. I was just trying to protect my future, to make sure everything didn't fall apart. I didn't want to hurt anyone. Clara, she was too inquisitive, too stubborn. She wouldn't let things go, and that's why I had to stop her." Miss Marple's heart raced as the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. Pierce had done it. He had silenced Clara to protect his own interests, just as Mrs. Darby had described. But there was still more to the story. Clara hadn't just been in the way of Pierce's plans. She had uncovered something far more dangerous in Carrington. Miss Marple asked quietly, "What about him? Where does he fit into all of this?" Pierce stiffened at the mention of Carrington's name. His eyes darted toward the door, as if considering an escape, but he remained seated, his fingers nervously tapping the arm of the chair. "Carrington, ... Pierce said slowly, his voice tight. "He was the one who set it all in motion. He used me, and I thought I was doing what I had to do to survive. I never meant for it to get this far, Miss Marple. I was just trying to stay on top. And now," Miss Marple pressed, "now that you've been caught, what do you plan to do?" Pierce's expression darkened, his features hardening into something more dangerous. "There's nothing left to do. It's too late now." Miss Marple stood up slowly, her eyes fixed on him. She had everything she needed, everything that would expose the truth, everything that would bring the darkness into the light. "You're wrong, Mr. Pierce," she said, her voice unwavering. "It's never too late to make things right. But the truth always comes out in the end. You'll see." As Miss Marple turned to leave, she could feel the weight of the storm outside, its fury building once again. But the storm that was brewing inside the walls of St. Mary Mead was far more dangerous. Pierce had been exposed, but Carrington was still out there. and the truth was just beyond reach. The final confrontation was inevitable. And Miss Marple, as always, was prepared. The rain had stopped by the time Miss Marple left Pierce's cottage, but the oppressive heaviness that had settled over the village remained. The skies, dark and brooding, reflected the tension that had begun to permeate St. Mary Mead. The storm had passed, but the unsettling quiet that followed left Miss Marple with the distinct feeling that the calm before the storm was far from over. It was not the weather that unnerved her, was the growing sense that they were all walking a fine line between the truth and the dangerous secrets that had been buried for so long. Miss Marple had learned to trust her instincts, and right now, her instincts were telling her that something far more sinister was at play than even she had initially suspected. Edward Pierce had been the key to understanding much of the mystery surrounding Clara Ashton's death. But there was more to the story, much more. The deeper Miss Marple dug, the more tangled the web became. Carrington, Pierce, the Darby's it. It was clear that they were all tied together in a conspiracy that reached far beyond what anyone had realized. But Clara's death had uncovered a secret that threatened to unravel everything. As Miss Marple walked toward the village square, her mind was consumed by the revelation she had just uncovered. Pierce, desperate and afraid, had admitted to his involvement in Clara's murder, but his confession had raised more questions than answers. Clara had known too much. But what exactly had she discovered? Miss Marple had learned from years of observation that the truth often hid in plain sight. The way people behaved, the small details they let slip could tell you everything you needed to know. And now, the quiet town was beginning to reveal its secrets. There was no turning back. When Miss Marple arrived at the square, the usual bustle of village life had been replaced by a hushed murmur. The villagers were on edge, their faces tense with anticipation. It seemed that the news of Clara's death had already spread, and with it, the questions. The once idyllic village was no longer a place of peace. It had become a place of suspicion. She crossed the square and made her way toward Mrs. Whitaker's shop. The postmistress had been a valuable source of information in the past, and Miss Marple knew that the village's heartbeat often beat strongest in the places where gossip flowed freely. Mrs. Whitaker was standing by the counter when Miss Marple entered, her eyes lifting from the papers in front of her. "Ah, Miss Marple," Mrs. Whitaker said, offering a tight smile. "Had a feeling you might stop by. Terrible business, this whole thing. The village hasn't been the same since it happened." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her tone as measured as ever. "But the truth often has a way of coming to light, Mrs. Whitaker. Sometimes it's only a matter of time." Mrs. Whitaker nodded solemnly, folding her hands on the counter. "That's true, Miss Marple, but truth has a way of changing things, in ways we don't always expect. I hear Pierce's name is on everyone's lips. I've heard more than one person say they think he had something to do with it." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, intrigued by Mrs. Whitaker's insight. "And what do you think, Mrs. Whitaker? Do you think he's guilty?" The postmistress hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting nervously around the shop. "I don't know, Miss Marple. There's something about him that just doesn't sit right with me. But then again, there's always something about people that we can't quite put our finger on, isn't there?" Miss Marple studied Mrs. Whitaker, her mind processing the implications of the conversation. "And what about Carrington?" she asked casually. "Have you heard anything about him? He seems to have quite an influence in the village." At the mention of Carrington's name, Mrs. Whitaker stiffened, her expression changing ever so slightly. "Carrington," she said, almost too quickly. "Oh, I've heard plenty about him. People say he's a man of power, a man who doesn't take kindly to being crossed. But I wouldn't be too quick to judge him. He's always been a fixture in the village." It's hard to imagine him as anything other than the respectable landowner he's always appeared to be. Miss Marple took in Mrs. Whitaker's words carefully, noting the slight edge in her voice when Carrington was mentioned. "You don't sound entirely convinced," she remarked. Mrs. Whitaker's eyes flickered, and she quickly forced a smile. "Well, you know how it is in a small village. People like to talk. I suppose there's more to Carrington than meets the eye, but I wouldn't want to say anything too rash." Miss Marple's mind was already churning with the new information. Mrs. Whitaker's hesitance had spoken volumes. The postmistress had revealed more than she realized. Carrington's influence in the village was undeniable, and it seemed he had earned a certain amount of protection. But there was something deeper, something hidden behind the facade of respectability. Miss Marple couldn't help but wonder what Carrington had to hide, and whether it had anything to do with Clara's death. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitaker," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but firm. "You've been most helpful. I think I'll pay a visit to Carrington next. I believe it's time I spoke with him directly." Mrs. Whitaker looked taken aback but nodded politely. "I'm sure he'll be happy to see you, Miss Marple. He's always been a gentleman, after all." Miss Marple gave her a tight smile before turning and leaving the shop. The rain had stopped, but the air was still thick with tension. The village was waiting for something to happen, something that would change everything. Miss Marple knew that the time was drawing near. She made her way toward Carrington's estate, a large and imposing house that had stood at the edge of the village for as long as anyone could remember. The estate was a symbol of power and wealth, and Miss Marple had always felt a certain unease when walking through its gates. There was a quiet arrogance about the place, a sense that its owner believed he could control everything within his reach. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that power, no matter how firmly it seemed to be held, was always vulnerable, and Carrington, for all his influence, was no exception. When Miss Marple arrived at the estate, she was met at the door by a servant, who ushered her into a large, richly decorated sitting room. Carrington was sitting by the fire, his face calm, but with a glint of something unreadable in his eyes. He rose when he saw her, his expression polite but distant. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth but with a slight edge. "I wasn't expecting your visit. Please, have a seat." Miss Marple sat down, her eyes carefully studying him. "Mr. Carrington, I'm afraid I'm here on business. The events of the past few days have caused quite a stir in the village, and I'm afraid we must speak about Clara Ashton." Carrington's smile faltered for just a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "Clara's death is a terrible tragedy," he said, his tone almost rehearsed. "But I'm sure the police are handling it. What is it that you need from me, Miss Marple?" "I think you know why I'm here," Miss Marple said softly. "There are things you and I both know that no one else does. I believe it's time that the truth comes to light." Carrington's smile disappeared entirely, replaced by a cold, calculating gaze. "You've been asking the right questions, Miss Marple, but some things are better left buried." Miss Marple's eyes never wavered, not for much longer. Final confrontation was drawing nearer. Miss Marple could feel it in her bones. The truth was close, and when it came, it would expose everything: Carrington's lies, Pierce's manipulation, and the darkness that had been hiding in plain sight for far too long. Chapter 05. The air inside. Carrington's grand sitting room was heavy, charged with an undercurrent of tension that seemed to hang between Miss Marple and the landowner like a tangible force. Carrington's face, once composed, now bore the unmistakable signs of a man caught off guard. Miss Marple's words had pierced through his calm exterior, and though he maintained his polished demeanor, the flicker of discomfort in his eyes had not escaped her notice. The fire crackled in the hearth, but the warmth it provided did little to cut through the coldness of the conversation. Miss Marple remained seated, her posture relaxed but alert, as she watched Carrington carefully. The man across from her was no longer the confident, aloof figure he had been when they first met. There was a subtle unease about him now, a recognition that the walls he had so carefully built were beginning to crumble. "You seem surprised to see me, Mr. Carrington," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but imbued with an almost imperceptible edge. "But I believe we've reached a point where we can no longer avoid the truth." Carrington's lips tightened, and he lowered his gaze for a moment, clearly weighing his next words. "I don't know what you think you've uncovered, Miss Marple, but I assure you, you're mistaken. This is just a tragic, senseless death, and nothing more." Miss Marple smiled faintly, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "A tragic death, yes, but not a senseless one. Clara Ashton knew something that had the potential to expose the secrets you and Mr. Pierce have worked so hard to protect. It seems she was asking the right questions that were far too dangerous for her to ask." Carrington's gaze shifted, and Miss Marple could see the internal battle playing out behind his eyes. He was trying to keep his composure, but the cracks were beginning to show. "Clara was curious," he said slowly, the words carefully chosen. "She was young and idealistic. She was also reckless. She began digging into matters that had nothing to do with her. It's no surprise that she ended up in over her head. And yet," Miss Marple continued, her voice steady, "it's not just Clara who has been digging. There are others involved in this. Mr. Carrington, you and Mr. Pierce have played your parts in something much larger than land deals. You've been using the Darby estate for far more than simple business transactions." Carrington's face flushed slightly, but his tone remained controlled. "You're going too far, Miss Marple. I won't stand here and let you make baseless accusations." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing just enough to let him know she wasn't backing down. "You may not like hearing it, but the truth has a way of coming to light, Mr. Carrington. And when it does, you will find there is no way to escape it." Carrington's jaw tightened, but Miss Marple could see the subtle shift in his posture. Quiet admission that the walls were closing in on him, could feel the weight of his own actions catching up to him. "Okay?" And Miss Marple could almost see him calculating how much longer he could hold on to the facade of innocence. But the longer he tried to deflect, the more desperate he seemed. "Tell me, Mr. Carrington," Miss Marple said softly, her voice cutting through the silence. "How long have you been manipulating the Darby estate? How long have you and Pierce been involved in those land deals? And how far does this conspiracy stretch? Because I have a feeling that Clara was only the tip of the iceberg." Carrington's eyes flicked toward the window, as though he was considering fleeing, but he quickly dismissed the thought. He was trapped, and they both knew it. "You have no proof, Miss Marple," he said, his voice strained. "You're just an old woman with a penchant for meddling. You think you understand everything, but you don't. You have no idea what you're dealing with." "I understand more than you think, Mr. Carrington," Miss Marple said quietly. "I understand that people like human who think they can control everything are always vulnerable when their secrets start to unravel. I also understand that Clara's death wasn't just an accident. It wasn't random. She knew something you wanted to keep buried." Carrington's hands clenched into fists, the first sign of genuine emotion Miss Marple had seen from him. He stood, abruptly pacing across the room, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He turned to face her, his eyes cold, the mask of composure slipping. "You think you're going to solve this?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you'll uncover the truth and expose me, but you're wrong. People like you people, who think they can dig up the past, don't understand how much power I have. The truth isn't what you think it is, okay? And when you get too close, you'll regret it." Miss Marple remained seated, her gaze unwavering. "You're right about one thing, Mr. Carrington. The truth is never what we expect. But you're also wrong. I've spent my entire life watching people. I've seen how they act, how they lie, how they hide their secrets, okay? And I've seen how they crack when they're confronted with the truth. Carrington's face contorted with barely suppressed fury, but Miss Marple did not flinch. She had seen that look before, in men far more dangerous than Carrington. The anger that burned in his eyes only confirmed what she had suspected. He was not as untouchable as he thought. "Why did you do it, Mr. Carrington?" Miss Marple asked, her voice quiet but sharp. "Why go to such lengths to protect a web of lies? What did you gain from all of this?" Carrington's eyes flashed, and, for a brief moment, Miss Marple saw the faintest hint of something regret, perhaps, or fear pass through him, but he quickly masked it, his cold exterior returning. "You don't understand," he said, his voice now low and full of venom. "It was never about the land. It was never about money. It was about power. You can't see it, but the people in this village, they think they know everything. They think they control their own lives, but they don't. I control them. I've controlled this village for years, and no one is going to ruin it for me now." Miss Marple remained silent for a moment, allowing the words to sink in. She had heard the confession, thinly veiled as it was. Carrington was not just a landowner. He was a man who believed he could manipulate everything around him. And when Clara had started digging, when she had begun to see through the cracks, he had resorted to desperate measures. The storm outside had begun to grow quieter, the last traces of thunder rumbling in the distance. But inside Carrington's estate, the storm was just beginning. Miss Marple could feel Carrington's defiance, his unwillingness to back down, yet the pieces were falling into place. Clara had uncovered something that threatened Carrington's control, and now Miss Marple was on the verge of exposing it. She stood up slowly, her eyes never leaving Carrington's. "You've said enough, Mr. Carrington, but I still have one more question. Where is Pierce?" Carrington's eyes widened imperceptibly. For a moment, he hesitated, then quickly masked it with a cold smile. "What makes you think I know?" Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. "Because you know everything. Sooner or later, the truth always comes out. It's just a matter of time." Carrington turned away from her, his back stiff with anger. "You'll never get the answers you want, Miss Marple. And when you fail, it will be too late for you." As Miss Marple stepped toward the door, she felt the weight of the case pressing down on her. The final confrontation was near, and she could see it clearly now. She wasn't just uncovering a murder. She was exposing a dangerous conspiracy that had taken root in the heart of St. Mary Mead. The truth was within reach, and Miss Marple was determined to bring it into the light. The storm had passed, but the calm was fleeting. The storm inside the estate was just beginning. Miss Marple, as always, was ready to face it head-on. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a heavy, damp chill in the air that seemed to cling to the village, as though the storm had left a mark upon it that would not soon fade. Miss Marple stood at the edge of Carrington's estate, her mind working furiously to piece together the last bits of the puzzle. The conversation with Carrington had given her more than enough to move forward, but there was still one missing link: Edward Pierce. The man was a key player in this tangled web of lies. But where was he now? As she turned away from the estate, the weight of her decision pressed heavily upon her. She had gathered enough evidence to make her suspicions clear, but the final confrontation was inevitable. The time had come to lay the truth bare before Carrington, Pierce, and the Darbys. But Miss Marple knew better than to rush into things. Every detail had to be in place, and there was still one last question she needed answered, one final piece of the puzzle that would bring everything into the light. The village square was quiet as Miss Marple made her way back toward her cottage. The storm had cleared, but a sense of unease still hung in the air. It was as if the village itself knew that something had shifted, that the calm facade of St. Mary Mead was no longer so secure. The air felt heavy with anticipation. Everyone knew that something was about to happen, but no one knew what dot as Miss Marple walked. She passed by a small group of villagers gathered outside the inn. They were whispering among themselves, their heads bent together as they spoke in hushed tones. The words she caught, though faint, were enough to make her pause. "Did you hear? They found Pierce?" The mention of his name stopped Miss Marple in her tracks. She turned her head slightly, listening intently. "He was hiding out in the woods, just outside the village," one of the villagers said, her voice laced with disbelief. "Can you imagine, after everything that's happened? He thought he could just disappear." "He didn't get far," another voice added. "The constable found him this morning. Seems he was trying to escape, but I don't think he's going to get away this time." Miss Marple's heart raced. Pierce was closer than she had anticipated. She knew she had to act quickly. There was no time to waste. The villagers, unaware of her presence, continued their conversation, speculating about what Pierce's capture meant for the village. But Miss Marple had already made up her mind. She would speak to Pierce. She would confront him with everything she knew, everything he had tried to hide. As Miss Marple made her way toward the constable's office, her mind was racing. What had led Pierce to run? What had he hoped to accomplish by fleeing? He had been so careful up until now, but something had driven him to make this desperate move. Miss Marple suspected that the truth was about to come spilling out. The question was, would Pierce break under pressure, or would he try to cover his tracks once again? She entered the constable's office and was greeted by the familiar sight of Constable Hawkins. His brow furrowed with concentration as he flipped through some papers on his desk. When he saw her, his expression softened, and he nodded in acknowledgement. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low. "I'm glad you've arrived. We've just taken Pierce into custody. He's in the holding cell. I'm not sure how much longer he's going to hold up under questioning, but we've got him." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze steady. "I'm not here for the questioning, Hawkins. I'm here to speak with him, alone." Hawkins raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He understood Miss Marple well enough to know that when she had a plan, she saw it through. He stood up and motioned for her to follow him. "I'll leave you to it, then. But be careful, Miss Marple. I've never seen him this agitated. He knows the jig is up." "I'm aware," Miss Marple replied quietly. "But sometimes it's the quietest moments that bring the truth to the surface." Hawkins unlocked the holding cell and stepped aside, allowing Miss Marple to enter. Inside, Pierce was pacing restlessly, his eyes darting toward the door as she stepped in. His usual calm demeanor was gone, replaced by a nervous energy that seemed to radiate off of him. His clothes were disheveled, and his face was pale. The stress of the past few days etched into every line of his face. "You don't look well, Mr. Pierce," Miss Marple said softly, her voice almost kind. "I hope you haven't been making yourself too comfortable in here." Pierce stopped pacing and turned to face her, his eyes narrowing. "What do you want, Miss Marple?" he demanded, his voice tense. "I'm not some fool you can talk circles around. I know what you're trying to do." Miss Marple remained calm, her eyes steady. "I'm not here to play games, Mr. Pierce. I'm here because it's time for the truth to come out. You've done everything you can to cover your tracks, but now the walls are closing in, and I'm afraid there's nowhere left for you to run." Pierce's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. He took a step back, clearly trying to regain some of the control he had lost. Miss Marple could see the fear in his eyes, no fear of the inevitable, but he wasn't ready to admit it yet. Not completely. Clara's death wasn't just a random act, was it? Miss Marple pressed. You didn't kill her because she was just a nuisance. You killed her because she found something you and Carrington had worked so hard to keep hidden. And now you're here, trying to run from the truth. Pierce's face twisted in anger, but the anger was quickly replaced by something else, something darker, something deeper. He took a deep breath, then let it out slowly. You don't know anything about me, Miss Marple, he said, his voice shaking. You don't understand what it's like to be trapped, to have no way out. Carrington, he controls everything. He makes the rules, and I was just trying to survive. I didn't have a choice. Everyone always has a choice, Mr. Pierce, Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but unwavering. But you chose the wrong one, and now you must face the consequences. For a moment, Pierce said nothing. He stood there, his hands trembling at his sides, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I never wanted this. I never wanted to hurt anyone, but I couldn't back out. Carrington, ... He made sure of that. Miss Marple studied him carefully, watching the shift in his expression as he spoke. There it was, the crack in his facade, a moment of weakness. I know you didn't, Miss Marple said softly, but you've crossed the line, Mr. Pierce, and now you'll have to answer for your actions. Case dropped his gaze, his shoulders slumping in defeat. The battle had been lost, and he knew it. The truth had caught up to him, and there was nowhere left for him to hide. Miss Marple stood silently for a moment, letting the weight of her words sink in. She had known all along that this moment would come, that Pierce would break. And when he did, the truth would be exposed. The storm outside had passed, but the storm inside the village was far from over. And Miss Marple was ready to bring it to an end. The final chapter of this mystery was unfolding before her, and the truth, as always, would prevail. Chapter 06. The rain had returned. Gentle at first, but soon enough the sky opened up once more, pouring sheets of water over the village. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the Darby estate, her umbrella barely shielding her from the downpour. She was well accustomed to the unpredictable weather in St. Mary Mead, and today was no different. The storm seemed to mirror the turmoil building within the village. The truth was finally within reach, but as she prepared for the final confrontation, Miss Marple knew that things would not come easily. Carrington and Pierce were cornered now, but both men still had their own agendas, and their desperation would make them dangerous. Miss Marple had spoken to Edward Pierce earlier that day in the holding cell, and while he had confessed his involvement in Clara Ashton's murder, it was clear that his guilt went far beyond a simple act of rage. Clara had uncovered something, far deeper, something connected to the illegal dealings between Carrington, Pierce, and the Darby estate. Carrington, the quiet power broker behind the curtain, had been the mastermind, but Pierce had been the one to carry out the darkest parts of the plan. And now, with Clara gone, there were no more barriers to the truth. But it was Carrington, not Pierce, who was the true key to unlocking everything. And it was Carrington that Miss Marple needed to confront next. Miss Marple made her way up to the grand entrance of the Darby estate, her steps slow and deliberate. The air felt thick with anticipation. Every corner of the estate seemed to whisper with secrets. She had spent a good deal of time observing the Darbys, listening to the rumors and stories that had floated through the village like smoke. But it wasn't until the past few days that she had truly begun to understand the depths of the deception at play. Mrs. Darby's earlier confessions had been an unexpected gift. The woman had been caught between guilt and fear, but her willingness to speak the truth had pushed Miss Marple closer to the heart of the mystery. Now it was time to confront Carrington himself, the puppet master who had manipulated everyone from the Darbys to Pierce to get what he wanted. As Miss Marple entered the drawing room, she found Carrington standing by the window, looking out at the rain. His back was to her, but she could tell he was aware of her presence. The silence between them stretched for a moment before he finally spoke. "Miss Marple," Carrington said, his voice as smooth as ever, though Miss Marple could hear a faint edge to it. "I was wondering when you would come." Miss Marple closed the door behind her and walked toward him, her movements slow and measured. "I knew you'd be expecting me, Mr. Carrington," she said softly, "but I doubt you knew how soon. Seems we've reached the end of the line." Carrington turned to face her, a faint smile playing on his lips. His eyes, however, held something darker, quiet recognition that the walls were closing in on him. "I suppose I should be impressed," he said, taking a step forward. "You've certainly been thorough in your investigation, Miss Marple. I didn't think you had it in you." Miss Marple's gaze remained steady, unwavering. "Phew. Underestimated me, Mr. Carrington. But then again, you've underestimated a great deal of things." "Okay." He raised an eyebrow, his smile still in place, but less certain now. "You think you understand everything, don't you? You think you've pieced it all together, but you're wrong. Clara Ashton's death, my dealings with Pierce, it's all a misunderstanding." "I don't think it's a misunderstanding at all," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice sharp with clarity. "I think it's a carefully constructed web of lies, one that you've been weaving for years, Mr. Carrington. You've been using the Darby estate, manipulating the people in this village, and it was all so that you could maintain control." Carrington's eyes flickered, and for just a moment, Miss Marple saw the cracks in his calm exterior, but he quickly masked it, his posture stiffening. "I didn't ask for your judgment, Miss Marple. I've built everything I have with my own hands. The land, the estate, none of it came easily. I had to fight for it, and if I had to make certain deals along the way, well, that's just the price of success." Miss Marple shook her head slowly, her expression soft but resolute. "Success? Is that what you call it? Power, greed, manipulation, those are your tools, not success. You've hurt people to get where you are, Mr. Carrington. Clara Ashton was just the latest victim of your game. But what you don't realize is that when you push people too far, they stop being pawns. They start fighting back." Carrington's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing. "Can you think you're the one who's going to expose me?" he asked, his voice thick with disbelief. "You think you can stop me?" Miss Marple's eyes never wavered from his. "I think the truth is unstoppable, Mr. Carrington, and you're not as invincible as you think." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the weight of Miss Marple's words hanging in the air between them. She could see Carrington's mind working, trying to come up with a plan, a way to salvage his carefully constructed world. But the more she watched him, the more Miss Marple realized that Carrington was desperate. He was cornered, and there was nowhere left for him to run. Finally, Carrington spoke again, his voice low and measured. "I suppose it's too late to ask for mercy then." Miss Marple's lips curled into a faint smile. "Mercy is something that must be earned, Mr. Carrington, and you haven't earned it." He looked at her for a long time, his eyes searching, perhaps for a sign that Miss Marple might still allow him an escape. Okay, but Miss Marple had seen it, all the manipulation, the lies, the power games. There was nothing left to hide. And there was no turning back now. "The evidence against you is clear, Mr. Carrington," she said, her voice unwavering. "I've spoken with Pierce. I've seen the documents. I know about the land deals, the illegal contracts, the threats. It's all in your hands, and now you'll have to face the consequences." Carrington's face turned pale, the weight of Miss Marple's words sinking in. For the first time, the mask of control he had worn so carefully began to slip. He was no longer the confident, powerful man he had been when Miss Marple first arrived. He was a man exposed, stripped of the power he had once wielded so effortlessly. I suppose I've underestimated you, Miss Marple, he said finally, his voice quiet but laced with bitterness. But it doesn't matter now. What's done is done. Miss Marple shook her head, her voice soft but resolute. No, Mr. Carrington, what's done is only just beginning. You will face the truth, and the village will see it for what it is. As Carrington slumped back into his chair, defeated, Miss Marple turned and walked toward the door, her steps deliberate and measured. The final pieces had fallen into place. The truth was out, and there was no escaping it now. The storm outside had finally stopped, and in its wake, the village of St. Mary Mead began to breathe again. The storm of secrets had passed, but the quiet aftermath was just beginning, and Miss Marple, as always, would be there to ensure that the truth prevailed. Miss Marple had always found that the final moments of a mystery were often the quietest, yet the most crucial. It wasn't the dramatic confrontations or the high-stakes revelations that held the true power. It was the moments of silence between the truth coming to light and the world reacting to it. As she left Carrington's estate, the weight of the conversation still hanging in the air, she felt that strange calm settle in her chest. The storm had broken, both outside and within the walls of the estate. But she knew that the last pieces of this puzzle were not yet in place. Carrington's admission, thinly veiled as it was, had been a significant victory, but there were still questions, small, seemingly insignificant details that had yet to be addressed. He had admitted his involvement, but the depths of his connections, the true extent of his manipulation, were still shrouded. Miss Marple knew that Clara had unearthed something critical, something that had sent her searching for the truth. But what exactly had she uncovered? There was a gap, a missing link in the chain. And it was that gap that Miss Marple needed to fill. The village was quieter than it had been in days. The usual hum of activity subdued. The storm had washed the streets clean, and now, under the pale light of the afternoon sky, the village seemed to be holding its breath. But Miss Marple had one more stop to make, one final conversation to have before everything would be revealed. The Darby estate loomed ahead of her once again. Mrs. Darby had been the reluctant confessor, but Miss Marple knew that there was more to uncover. The woman had confessed much, but had she confessed everything? The Darby family's role in the scheme, their knowledge of what had transpired, was still an unknown variable, and Miss Marple was certain that the final thread would lead back to them. As Miss Marple entered the Darby home, she was greeted by the familiar sight of the grand, yet now somber, entryway. Mrs. Darby was waiting for her in the drawing room, her posture still regal, but her eyes betraying the strain of the past few days. The once stately woman now looked older, weary, as if the weight of the truth had aged her in ways nothing else could. Miss Marple, Mrs. Darby said softly, her voice quieter than usual. I was expecting you. I suppose this is the final conversation, isn't it? Miss Marple nodded, taking a seat opposite Mrs. Darby. I believe it is. Mrs. Darby, we've come a long way, but there is still a piece of this puzzle left too. Soph, I know you've shared a great deal with me already, but there's still something I need to understand. Something you've yet to tell me. Mrs. Darby's face tightened, and for a brief moment, Miss Marple thought she might refuse to say anything more. But then, after a long pause, Mrs. Darby spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. You're right, she said. There is more. I've been trying to keep my family safe, Miss Marple, but I see now that the truth always comes out. I've been protecting them in the wrong way, I thought. I thought if I kept the secrets buried, it would all go away, but it didn't, and now it's too late. She understood the burden Mrs. Darby carried. The truth was never easy to confront, especially when it came to one's own family. What is it, Mrs. Darby? What haven't you told me? Mrs. Darby hesitated, her fingers nervously twisting a handkerchief in her lap. Finally, she looked up. her eyes meeting Miss Marple's with a mixture of guilt and resolve. It was my husband. He knew what Carrington was doing. They were in this together. And the land deals, the manipulation, they were just the beginning. There was more, much more. My husband thought that if we could hold on to the estate, everything else would fall into place. But he was wrong. It wasn't just about the land. Carrington was after something bigger. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing with curiosity. Something bigger, she repeated. What was he after, Mrs. Darby? Mrs. Darby swallowed hard, the words seeming to stick in her throat. Carrington wanted control, not just of the estate, but of the entire village. He was planning to use the Darby name to make it a cover for his dealings with Carrington's investors. He promised my husband that we would be at the top, but my husband, he didn't understand the price. Clara was right. Miss Marple uncovered it all. She knew about the investors, the false deals, the land, and that's why she had to be stopped. Miss Marple nodded slowly. The pieces were coming together, but she still had one final question. And where does Edward Pierce fit into all of this? You said earlier that he was just a tool. Okay. But why did he go along with it? Mrs. Darby's expression hardened, and a shadow crossed her face. Pierce was a man of ambition. He saw an opportunity with Carrington. He was promised wealth, power, security. He thought he could control the situation, but he didn't understand how deep Carrington's influence ran. Pierce became Carrington's right-hand man, but when things started unraveling, when Clara started to ask too many questions, Pierce realized that he was in too deep. He didn't want to be caught, Miss Marple. He thought he could escape, but that was never an option. Carrington made sure of that. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, the weight of the information settling over her. She had always known that Pierce's involvement had been far more than a simple case of greed. But now, it seemed there was a more complex web at play, a conspiracy that stretched far beyond land deals and money. Carrington's desire for control had led him to manipulate not only the Darbys, but the entire village, using his influence to pull the strings from behind the scenes. Pierce had been just another pawn, and Clara, in her pursuit of the truth, had become the victim. I see, Miss Marple said softly. So Clara had uncovered everything. She knew the truth about Carrington's plans and the extent of his manipulation. And that is what led to her death. Mrs. Darby nodded, her face pale with the weight of her confession. Yes, Clara had to be silenced. She was the one person who could destroy everything we had built. She knew too much. But I never thought it would come to this. I never thought. Her voice faltered, and Miss Marple could see the deep regret in her eyes. Miss Marple stood, her mind now racing through the final steps. The truth was now clear. It was time to bring it all to light, to expose Carrington, Pierce, and the Darbys for what they had done. But there was still one final piece to place. You've told me everything I needed to know, Mrs. Darby, Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but resolute. I'm going to make sure the truth is heard. There's still one more thing we must do. The police need to hear this. Mrs. Darby looked up at her with a mixture of fear and hope in her eyes. Will it be enough, Miss Marple? Miss Marple gave her a small, reassuring smile. It will be enough. The truth always has a way of finding its way to the surface, Mrs. Darby, and when it does, it will set everything right. As Miss Marple turned to leave, she knew that the final confrontation was coming. It would be a storm unlike any the village had seen before, but it would bring the justice that Clara Ashton had been denied. And with that, Miss Marple stepped into the rain once more, ready to bring the truth into the light and expose the shadows that had held St. Mary Mead in their grip for far too long. Chapter 07. The village of St. Mary Mead seemed to hold its breath, the stillness in the air so thick that even the faintest sound felt amplified. The storm had passed, but the tension was palpable. Miss Marple had uncovered the truth, or at least most of it. Clara Ashton's death was no longer just a random tragedy. It was the unfortunate consequence of a web of manipulation spun by those who thought they were untouchable. But the final step was still to come. Bringing the truth to the people who could do something about it. The Darby estate loomed large behind Miss Marple as she made her way to the small office where the constable, Hawkins, was waiting for her. There was still a part of the mystery that Miss Marple had not yet fully pieced together, and that was how deeply the Darbys had been involved in Carrington's scheme. Mrs. Darby had confessed. Yes, but there was still the question of how far. Her complicity went hand whether she knew more than she had let on. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted as she arrived at the constable's office. The familiar creak of the wooden door signaled her arrival, and Hawkins looked up from the stack of papers on his desk. His expression, one of quiet anticipation. "Miss Marple," he said, standing to greet her. "I assume you've made some headway." Miss Marple gave a small nod as she took a seat across from Hawkins. "I have, Constable. It's all beginning to make sense now. But there's one last thing we need to discuss before we can move forward." Hawkins raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "The Darbys," Miss Marple said softly, leaning forward slightly. "Mrs. Darby has told me what she knows, but I suspect there is more. She mentioned that her husband had been aware of Carrington's dealings and that they had made an agreement, but I don't think that's the whole story. There's more to it than that." Hawkins took a deep breath and sighed. "I've been going through the records of the Darby estate, and I've found something that might interest you. There are financial transactions that don't add up. Money that seems to have been diverted into a private account that doesn't belong to any of the Darbys. I'm not saying Mrs. Darby was involved, but it's clear her husband had been making deals on the side, and it seems they were all connected to Carrington." Miss Marple's brow furrowed as she absorbed the information. "That's exactly what I suspected. Mrs. Darby didn't want to admit her involvement, but I think she was more complicit than she realized, and that means she's still hiding something." Hawkins nodded, his face serious. "I agree. But what do you suggest we do next? Carrington is already in the wind, and Pierce, well, he's not talking." Miss Marple's eyes grew distant, her thoughts focused on the task at hand. "Carrington is the key. We can't expose the whole truth until we confront him directly. But first, we need to ensure that Mrs. Darby knows exactly how deep the conspiracy goes. It's time we called her back in for one final conversation." Hawkins hesitated for a moment, but nodded in agreement. "I'll make the arrangements, but do you think she'll be cooperative? After everything?" Miss Marple's lips twitched into a small smile. "She has no choice now, Hawkins. The truth is no longer something she can bury." When they arrived back at the Darby estate, Miss Marple was once again greeted by the butler, Mr. Hargrove, who led them through the familiar grand hallway and into the drawing room. Mrs. Darby was waiting, her hands folded in her lap, but this time her expression was less assured. There was a new unease in her eyes, a flicker of realization that the walls had begun to close in around her. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Darby said, rising from her seat as they entered. "I thought we were done discussing all this. Is there something more you need from me?" Miss Marple's gaze remained steady, her voice gentle but firm. "I'm afraid we're not quite finished, Mrs. Darby. There are still pieces to this puzzle that need to be put into place." Mrs. Darby stiffened, but Miss Marple could see her shoulders sag slightly. The woman had clearly been through much, but now it was time for the final truth to come out. Miss Marple sat down across from her, Hawkins standing behind her, ready for whatever might come next. "Mrs. Darby," Miss Marple began, her tone soft but resolute. "You've told me what you know about the land deals, about your husband's involvement with Carrington, in the way Clara Ashton's death is tied to all of this. But I have reason to believe that there's more you haven't shared. I believe your husband wasn't the only one involved. I believe you were complicit in some of these dealings. Mrs. Darby's face paled, her eyes widening with shock. But Miss Marple did not give her a moment to respond. I've seen the financial records, Miss Marple continued, and they don't lie. There's money that doesn't belong to your family, diverted into accounts that don't match up with any legitimate dealings. And when I asked about this earlier, you were evasive. Why? Mrs. Darby's lips trembled, and for a moment, she looked like she might collapse under the weight of Miss Marple's questioning. But then, after a long silence, she spoke, her voice cracking with a mixture of shame and resignation. You're right, Miss Marple, Mrs. Darby whispered. I didn't want to admit it. I didn't want to believe it. But it's all true. My husband, he was involved, yes. But so was I when we realized what Carrington was doing. We thought we could protect the estate, protect our legacy, but the guy, Dilsey, made us complicit. He promised us security, and we took it. I thought it was the only way to keep everything intact. I was wrong. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle but firm. And Clara, did you know what she had discovered? Mrs. Darby closed her eyes briefly, then nodded, her shoulders sinking as if she could no longer carry the weight of her own guilt. Clara found everything. She found the hidden accounts, the secret deals. She was going to expose Carrington, expose us all. And when she did, we panicked. I didn't know what to do. Tears welled in Mrs. Darby's eyes, and she wiped them away quickly. I never wanted anyone to get hurt, but Clara, she was too dangerous. We couldn't risk her telling the world what she'd found. I never thought it would come to this. Marple's expression softened, but her resolve remained unchanged. I understand, Mrs. Darby, but you've already done the hardest thing. You've told the truth. Now it's time for you to help put everything right. For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of Mrs. Darby's confession settling over them all. Miss Marple could see that the woman had finally admitted to herself what she had known all along, that the truth, no matter how painful, was the only thing that could free her from the guilt she had carried for so long. Hawkins stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with compassion. We'll need to take the information you've given us to the authorities, Mrs. Darby. But this is a start. The truth will come out, and the people who have been responsible for all of this will be held accountable. Mrs. Darby nodded, her face pale but resolute. I just want this to be over. I never wanted this life for my family. I wanted to protect them, but I see now that I was only protecting the wrong things. Miss Marple rose from her chair, her eyes soft but unwavering. It's never too late to do the right thing, Mrs. Darby. The road ahead may not be easy, but it's the only way forward. Miss Marple left the Darby estate. She knew that the storm was far from over, but the end was near, and the truth was finally within reach. The village would soon know what had happened, the secrets, the lies, the manipulation. And when it was all revealed, St. Mary Mead would be forever changed. But Miss Marple was ready. She had known from the start that the truth was always worth pursuing, no matter how dark the path. And now it was time for everything to come to light. The air was thick with tension as Miss Marple stood in front of the Darby estate, her thoughts racing. The storm had passed, but the calm after it felt more like a lull before the final confrontation. The truth was on the verge of being fully uncovered, everything that had been hidden, all the secrets kept behind closed doors, was about to be exposed. Miss Marple could feel it, the weight of the revelation pressing down on her shoulders. She had spoken to Mrs. Darby, piecing together the final details of the conspiracy that had entwined the Darby family, Carrington and Pierce. The woman had confessed everything, from the land deals to the hidden accounts, the manipulation and the lies. And Clara Ashton, with her insatiable curiosity, had uncovered it all. But it had cost her life. Her desire for the truth had led her to an inevitable end, one that Miss Marple had known was coming, though it did nothing to soften the blow. Now there was only one thing left to do: confront Carrington, the man at the center of it all. Okay, the puppet master who had used everyone around him for his own gain. He was the one pulling the strings, the one who had orchestrated the web of deceit that had ensnared so many. And Miss Marple knew that the only way to stop him was to expose him for what he was. She made her way to Carrington's estate, the steps leading up to his imposing mansion seeming almost too quiet. The grand home, with its vast windows and high columns, looked untouched by the storm. But inside, Miss Marple knew it was anything but calm. The secrets Carrington had worked so hard to keep hidden were ready to unravel, and when they did, there would be no more pretending. As she entered the front hall, the butler greeted her with a look of surprise. "Miss Marple, I wasn't expecting you," he said, but there was a nervous edge to his voice that Miss Marple noticed immediately. "I'm sure Mr. Carrington is expecting me," Miss Marple replied with a calm smile. She was aware that the man was likely just as anxious as everyone else in the house. After all, the walls had been closing in for days, and now there was no way out. The butler hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Of course, Miss Marple. Right this way." Miss Marple followed him through the grand hallway, her mind sharpening with every step. She had the pieces of the puzzle: Carrington's involvement, Kirsty's complicity, the Darby's secrecy, but there was still something gnawing at her, something that felt unfinished. She had no doubt about Carrington's guilt, but there was one more thread she needed to pull, one last detail that would bring everything into focus. When they reached the study, the butler opened the door and stepped aside, allowing Miss Marple to enter. Carrington was sitting behind his desk, his posture stiff, his hands folded in front of him. His usual composure was starting to slip. His eyes were tight, his lips pressed into a thin line. He had been waiting for her. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice steady but lacking its usual arrogance. "I didn't expect you to come here today. You've gathered what you think is the truth, but it's not as simple as you believe." Miss Marple didn't sit down, but instead stood near the desk, her eyes never leaving his. "You've been playing a dangerous game, Mr. Carrington," she said quietly. "One that has cost more than you realize. Clara Ashton is dead because of you, and now it's time for you to face the consequences of your actions." Carrington's eyes darkened, and for a moment he seemed to recoil, but he quickly regained his composure. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said with a faint smile, though the words held no conviction. "Clara's death was an unfortunate accident. She was a fool to dig into matters that didn't concern her. I had nothing to do with it." "Nothing to do with it," Miss Marple repeated, her voice calm but full of disbelief. "You are the very reason this has all happened, Mr. Carrington. It was your dealings, your manipulation, your need for control that led to Clara's death. She uncovered the truth, and you made sure she paid for it. But the truth doesn't go away, no matter how hard you try to bury it." Carrington's face remained frozen, but the flicker of panic in his eyes gave him away. He stood up suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You don't know the whole story, Miss Marple. You think you've figured everything out, but you're missing the most important piece, the thing that ties it all together." Miss Marple took a step forward, her gaze unwavering. "I don't need to know anything more, Mr. Carrington. What I do know is enough to bring everything to light. You were using the Darby estate to cover your own illicit dealings, and when Clara started asking questions, you knew you had to silence her. Pierce may have carried out the deed, but you were the one who orchestrated it." Carrington's jaw tightened, and he took a deep breath, clearly trying to compose himself. "You're wrong," he he said, his voice low but deadly calm. You don't understand the stakes. This wasn't about power or greed. It was about survival. I had to do what I did to protect everything I've worked for. And what exactly have you worked for, Mr. Carrington? Miss Marple asked softly. A legacy built on lies, a fortune built on blood. What will you have left when the truth comes out? The tension in the room was thick, and Miss Marple could sense that Carrington was on the verge of breaking. She had seen this before, the moment when a person realizes that their carefully constructed world is falling apart, and there is nothing they can do to stop it. Carrington's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. You're too late. He spat, his voice now tinged with desperation. It's already done. You can't undo it. Miss Marple tilted her head, her gaze sharp. You're right, Mr. Carrington. What's done can't be undone. But the truth is still coming, whether you want it to or not. He stared at her for a long moment, and then, with a sudden movement, he slumped back into his chair, his face drained of color. It's over then, he whispered. There's no way out. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unreadable. Yes, it's over. But you've only just begun to face the consequences of what you've done. As she turned to leave the study, Miss Marple's mind was already shifting to the next step. The pieces had all fallen into place, and now the final chapter of the mystery was ready to unfold. She knew that the village would soon hear the full story. The truth that had been buried for so long would finally be revealed. As she stepped into the hallway, the quiet of the house seemed to deepen, and Miss Marple knew that everything would soon come to light. The village of St. Mary Mead had lived under the shadow of lies for too long, but that shadow was finally lifting. The storm had passed, and the calm that followed would be the calm of truth, and in the end, truth was all Miss Marple had ever really needed. Miss Marple stood in the quiet hallway of Carrington's estate, her heart calm and steady despite the gravity of the situation. She had done it. She had peeled away the layers of deception that had shrouded the village and exposed the truth. Carrington had finally broken, and now there was no denying the dark web of lies that had been spun over the years. As she walked down the long corridor, her mind replayed the confrontation in Carrington's study. The man, once so confident and untouchable, had crumbled before her eyes. Agatha, he had so carefully crafted over the years, had fallen apart. His final admission, his confession, had been the confirmation she needed to bring the entire conspiracy to light. But the work wasn't over. No, the real task had only just begun. Miss Marple had to ensure that the truth reached those who needed to hear it. The village had to know, and so did the authorities. Carrington could no longer control the narrative, and neither could Pierce. It was time for the community to face what had been lurking in the shadows for so long. As she left the estate, her thoughts shifted to the next steps. The constable would need to be informed, and arrangements would have to be made to ensure the truth was revealed in the most effective way possible. But there was one final step. Miss Marple needed to take one final piece of the puzzle that would put everything into perspective. The village square was nearly empty when Miss Marple arrived, the damp air still carrying the remnants of the storm. She was surprised to see Mrs. Darby standing by the fountain, her face a mixture of worry and determination. The woman had always been an enigma, caught between guilt and denial. But now, Miss Marple knew the time had come for her to face the truth too. Miss Marple, Mrs. Darby said softly as she approached, her voice hesitant. I was hoping to speak with you. Miss Marple gave her a knowing smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. I thought you might want to, she said. The truth is always harder to carry when you've hidden it for so long. Mrs. Darby's shoulders slumped slightly as she met Miss Marple's gaze. I've been thinking about everything, and I don't know what's worse, what we did or what we allowed to happen. We've lied to everyone, and now there's no way to take it back. Miss Marple took a deep breath, allowing Mrs. Darby the space to speak. You've come to the right conclusion, Mrs. Darby. The truth has a way of revealing itself, no matter how hard we try to keep it hidden. Mrs. Darby looked away for a moment, her eyes cast downward. You're right. Clara was the one who started this whole thing. She started asking questions, digging into things she shouldn't have. But I thought I could stop her from finding the truth. And now, I've lost everything. Miss Marple watched her closely, noting the way Mrs. Darby spoke with such regret. There was no doubt in Miss Marple's mind that the woman had made some terrible decisions. But what mattered now was how she would move forward. You've lost more than you know. Mrs. Darby, Miss Marple said gently, but it's not too late to make things right. You've already started by admitting the truth. That's more than most would ever do. Mrs. Darby raised her eyes to meet Miss Marple's, and there was a spark of something, perhaps hope, or perhaps the faintest glimmer of redemption. Do you really think there's any way to fix this? Can we undo all the damage we've caused? Miss Marple smiled, though it was a small, knowing smile. The truth always has a way of setting things right, Mrs. Darby. It's not about undoing the past, it's about facing it. You can't change what happened, but you can be part of the solution. A quiet moment passed between them, and Mrs. Darby's shoulders seemed to relax. The weight of her guilt was still there, but it wasn't as suffocating as it had been before. She had come to terms with her role in the scheme, and now, for the first time, she could see a way forward. I'll help, Mrs. Darby said, her voice steady with a newfound resolve. I'll make sure everything is known, okay? I'll speak the truth, no matter what it costs. Miss Marple gave her an approving nod. That's all anyone can ask of you. Just then, the sound of footsteps echoed across the square, and the constable, Hawkins, appeared at the far end. He had been waiting, as Miss Marple had instructed, ready to take the next steps in the investigation. He walked toward them, his expression serious, but tempered with the knowledge that the end of this long investigation was finally within sight. Miss Marple, Hawkins said, tipping his hat in greeting. I've been informed by the constables that Carrington is in custody. He confessed everything. The details match what you said. Everything's falling into place. Miss Marple nodded, her mind already moving ahead. Skid Hawkins. But there's still much to be done. We need to ensure that the full truth comes to light. Carrington, Pierce, and the Darby family. All of it. The village needs to know what happened. Hawkins glanced at Mrs. Darby, who was standing beside Miss Marple, and then back at Miss Marple. I'll make the arrangements, he said. The constable and I will bring everything to the authorities. The village will know the truth, and we'll see that justice is done. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Thank you, Hawkins. It's not often that the truth comes so clearly into focus, but when it does, there's nothing left to hide. Mrs. Darby stepped forward, her voice trembling with resolve. I'll make sure the people in the village know everything. It's time they understood the truth, okay? Maybe, just maybe, they'll forgive us. Miss Marple gave her a reassuring smile. The truth is the only thing that can heal the wounds, Mrs. Darby. And once it's all out in the open, the village can move forward. With the final pieces of the mystery now in place, Miss Marple turned and walked toward the constable's office, her steps steady and purposeful. The storm had passed, both literal and figurative. The lies had been exposed, the guilty parties held accountable, and the village could begin to heal from the secrets that had tainted it for so long. The truth had one dot, and Miss Marple, as always, had been there to make sure it came to light.